Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is the Green Energy Consumers Alliance, and we have a webinar about offshore wind. Let's make the best of 2021. This is our take as a nonprofit organization on what offshore wind means for New England. That we're based in Boston, Massachusetts, and Providence, Rhode Island, and what we'll be talking about is from the perspective of those two states. With me is Kai Salem, our policy coordinator, and Mal Skovrin, our program associate. Mal, if you could advance the slide, please. Just as you might expect, we had over 200 people RSVP for today, so everyone's muted to avoid background noise. If you have questions, send them in the Q&A box on GoToWebinar, and we'll answer the questions at the end. Mal's going to help us. We may not get to every question, but we'll be here for as long as we can to answer questions. The webinar is being recorded, and we'll certainly send the slides out to you shortly after this event. Next slide. So our organization is a nonprofit, and our mission is to harness the power of energy consumers to speed the transition to a low carbon future. We're entering into our 39th year. We do most of our work in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, where we have 2 offices, and but we do some other things in other states. We have a range of programs that consumers can tap into to reduce your carbon footprint or to save money, or both. And that makes us a little bit unusual for nonprofits in that we enter into the market, particularly for renewable energy, electric cars, and but we also have an advocacy component, what you might expect normally from a nonprofit. And we try to interact with the state and local governments, not so much federal, on public policy that affects energy and energy consumers. And again, tying it all back to our mission. You can learn more about us at greenenergyconsumers.org. Next slide. Today, we are going to try to cover why offshore wind is the key to our climate goals, or maybe not the only key, but certainly maybe the biggest key. And that is, we try not to be advocates for any one particular technology. We try to figure out where they fit into the mix, because the goal is reducing climate emissions from greenhouse gases. Then we'll talk about upcoming projects, offshore wind projects in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Then Kai will provide a policy update, what's going on with the policies that could make more offshore wind happen in the future. And very important, we're going to try to provide you with some information about how you can do your part. It's all about civic engagement. What can you do to bring offshore wind to our states? Now, I have to be clear, what we're not going to get into today are engineering issues involving offshore wind, or the financing even of offshore wind. And we're not going to get into the technical project details of the projects that we're going to talk about: Vineyard Wind, Mayflower Wind, Revolution Wind, and so on. You can get plenty of material on those on the internet if you want. And I'm willing to bet you that some of you on this call know more about the engineering and financing than we do. But we think what our role is to bring to sort of be an intermediary between the market, the industry, and government, and bring it to you so that you can be better citizens and better consumers. So with that, I will turn it to Kai for a couple slides, and then I'll get it back.
Thanks, Larry. We have some pretty big climate goals here in the Northeast, and we need to, because the climate crisis is urgent, and our goals are barely or not at all enough to meet the climate crisis in our states. So in Massachusetts, our climate commitments include a 45% goal of greenhouse gas reductions by 2030, 100% zero carbon by 2050, and our renewable portfolio standard mandates 35% renewable electricity by 2030. The climate bill that unfortunately was vetoed yesterday would have raised these commitments, so I'm just going off of what is currently in statute. And in Rhode Island, we also have some pretty big climate commitments, although they are all non-binding. They include 40% GHG reductions by 2035, 80% by 2050, and 100% renewable electricity by 2030. This legislative session in Rhode Island, we will be working to update all of these commitments and also to put them into statute so that Rhode Island has accountability to meeting these goals. These are pretty big commitments, but the good news is that we can meet them, and offshore wind is absolutely necessary to doing so. We'll go to the next slide. In order to meet all of these big goals, we're going to need to electrify our transportation and heating. Electricity is the main way that we can remove carbon from our energy system because we can produce electricity from wind and solar, whereas currently our transportation runs on gas, as well as our heating, natural gas. This chart shows how electrification is going to be integral to decarbonizing our transportation and heating sectors. That's those 4 top bars. They're going to have to drop dramatically in greenhouse gas reductions. This also only shows the 80% path rather than the 100% path that we know we need. And where are we going to get all of that electricity from? Next slide.
That's my slide. Thank you, Kai. And obviously later on in the presentation, we'll talk a little bit about the big developments regarding the governors of both Massachusetts and Rhode Island. We were awfully disappointed to see that Governor Baker vetoed a very good climate bill that was passed by the legislature. And now we have a change in governorship in the state of Rhode Island, and we'll see how that impacts offshore wind. The chart that Kai just showed was from a report that the Brattle Group did looking at the roadmap to reducing greenhouse gases by 2050 in order to meet the region's goals. And this particular slide shows where the electricity generation is probably going to come from. This is one scenario. They have some scenarios with different numbers. We think this one is probably the most realistic or reasonable for them to present. And they did this, I think, back in September. And what it shows is by 2050, we'll need to get 44% of our electricity generation. This is all of New England, not just Massachusetts or Rhode Island, from offshore wind projects and a lot of solar. That's the yellow slice of the pie. And it's important to look at this from perspective about how far we have to go. And over to the right is where we look at not the generation in terms of terawatt hours, but the capacity in terms of gigawatts. And so right now, they're suggesting in order to get to the 44% of our electricity generation, we need to build 43 gigawatts of offshore wind, of which right now we only have 30 gigawatts. So I'm sorry, 30 megawatts. So we have a long, long way to go. Next slide. So what we're going to present to you is sort of our pulling together from at least 4 reports. And when you get this in the email, you'll be able to read them on your own. But basically, the point is they all say roughly the same thing. Very smart experts are looking at this. How do we get to our goals by, say, 2030, 2040, 2050? And what does it mean? And so we've already talked about the Brattle Group's report back in, actually it's September of 2019, but just recently, December 30th, Massachusetts did a decarbonization roadmap study that had similar numbers to what we just showed you. And then very actively, the Brattle Group was hired by the state of Rhode Island to see how we could get to 100% renewable electricity in Rhode Island by 2030. That's in response to Governor Raimondo's executive order. And we'll show you that in a little bit. And then a few years ago, Synapse Energy Economics did an analysis of why it's important that we electrify transportation and heating. Next slide. So the point is, we're not making this up. What we're trying to do is pull it all together and show you what the experts are saying. This slide was presented by the Brattle Group, and what it shows is if we start adding a lot of offshore wind, how is it going to play out month by month? The object of the game is to reduce fossil fuel consumption, and that will differ based upon the month. But what's interesting here, just take a look at it. the production of offshore wind is coincident very much with winter weather. And that's an important thing. It's not even. In the summer, it's still very substantial. When you build that much offshore wind, it's going to be a high percentage of our electricity needs, but it really becomes important in January, February, and also November, December. That's when the wind's blowing very hard. The capacity factor of the wind turbines increases in those months, and that's important, especially if we want to electrify transportation and heating. Next slide. So this slide shows, this is from Synapse Energy Economics, a report in 2017. And what it said was, if we electrify cars, trucks, buses, trains, and all that, and we also shift from burning natural gas and oil to heat pumps, that's going to increase the amount of electricity that we need to consume. And year by year, that shows you, if we're going to do this at a pace to meet our climate goals of reducing emissions by anywhere between 80 and 100% by 2050, then eventually the impact will be larger on the winter months than the summer months. And so you can see that we're going to move the region from being a summer peaking region to a winter peaking region if we electrify everything. And so now basically I'm just trying to connect the dots. If you like heat pumps and you want to stay warm and reduce your carbon emissions, then you need to pay attention to what's happening with offshore wind. Next slide. And I guess the point I'm trying to make again is that there is no other renewable energy generation source that matches the winter demand quite so well as offshore wind. Now this slide is from Brattle. It's in directly response to what's a reasonable scenario for Rhode Island to get to 100% renewable energy by 2030. And what they're showing is what they have in current commitments are the blue and green bars going up to 2030. Rhode Island is already working on a project called Revolution Wind that's 400 megawatts, but there's a pretty big gap and between that and being 100% renewable energy. And what it supports the fact that the governor, Raimondo, wants to put out a solicitation for 600 more megawatts of offshore wind. And so that's something we applaud. But this shows you, if you really want to get to that, there is no other resource that can quite get us there in large chunks, very affordably, as offshore wind. So now back to Kai, who will run through the next several slides.
Thanks, Larry. Larry described well how much we need offshore wind to support current clean electricity needs, as well as the future clean electricity, which will involve heat pumps and electric transportation. So we'll need both more electricity, and we'll need more electricity in the winter when the new heating peak occurs. So right now we have a grand total of 5 wind turbines in the water that produce 30 megawatts. We're going to need a lot more than that, and we're going to need it soon. The good news is that offshore wind is coming. This chart shows exactly how much offshore wind, as of about, let's see, I think June 2020, was scheduled to interconnect to the regional electricity grid here in New England. The vast majority of new generation coming online in New England will be offshore wind, or at least that's what's scheduled to. And that shows 14,000 megawatts in the interconnection queue as of June 2020. Next slide. Here's another way of showing just how much offshore wind is coming to the East Coast. And the next online date is as soon as 2022 or 2023. These projects take a long time, and they have been delayed again and again, especially in the federal permitting process. So the online dates in the right column here is what we project, what we hope, but we do need to do everything we can to make sure that these come online on time. Next slide. So there are proposed 13.4 gigawatts by 2025. For context, next slide. That is just a huge number. That is what we use in New England on an average hour. So during the average hour of the year, not including peak times or super low electricity demand times, we use about that much. That's enough to power all of New England, or enough to power 11 million households, which is more than we have here in New England. And more is coming. That list does not include the 600 additional megawatts that we hope will be procured in Rhode Island by 2030. It doesn't include potential new procurements in Massachusetts that the climate bill indicated would be occurring, even though the climate bill did not pass. And the Massachusetts Clean Energy and Climate Plan, which was released just a couple of weeks ago, indicated that there will need to be an additional 6,000 megawatts procured between 2030 and 2040 to replace retiring generation and also meet the needs as electric transportation, and electric heating grow. Next slide. This is a little depiction of where some of that wind is coming from. These are the lease areas. So all of these areas a company is currently planning to develop offshore wind on. It also does not include the lease areas that go all the way down the East Coast that will also be supplying places like Maryland and New York, which has huge electricity needs. In Rhode Island, we have a few upcoming initiatives when it comes to offshore wind. Last year, Governor Raimondo passed an executive order to look at how Rhode Island could achieve 100% renewable electricity by 2030. This study has now been completed. It occurred over the course of the year, and it indicated very clearly that there are two major paths forward to get to that goal. One is invest deeply in offshore wind. Currently, offshore wind procurements get us to 30% of 2020 load. That's the 400 megawatt Revolution Wind project, which is still in development. And the additional 600 megawatt procurement, which was announced earlier this fall, would help Rhode Island reach 82% by 2030. And that takes into account future retirements of generation and also the growing electricity needs of our region. So currently, Rhode Island would only achieve 50% renewable electricity by 2030, given existing procurements and existing trajectories of renewable energy. So this procurement of 600 megawatts is really, really important when we talk about getting to 100% by renewable electricity by 2030. Obviously, there's a gap here. That gap could be made up by offshore wind procurements, energy efficiency, better solar programs. There's a bunch of ways to get to 100%. The other really key component of getting to 100% by 2030 in Rhode Island is making sure that this is part of our statute and not just an executive order goal. That's why we'll be advocating for a 100% renewable portfolio standard in Rhode Island this coming session. We want the renewable energy standard, which mandates a rising minimum of electricity that must be procured from renewable sources. We want that to achieve 100% by 2030 so that we can keep our government accountable and our utility companies accountable to getting to that 100% number. Next slide. Unfortunately, as we all mentioned, the climate bill that was passed by the General Court back in, I guess, January 4th it was, a couple days before the legislative session ended, that was vetoed by the governor yesterday. That bill would have increased the required number of megawatts to be procured by 2027 to 4,000 megawatts. Currently, that number is 1,600, and those 1,600 megawatts have already been procured through the Vineyard Wind projects. In addition to the required 1,600 megawatts, up to 3,200 megawatts are possible to be procured by the utility companies. So we still need to see those procurements happen. We hope that they do. 5,600 megawatts of wind by 2030 would really help us get to even just the 45% existing goal. And we advocate for a stronger goal than 45% by 2030. We think that the 50% goal by 2030 and that was in the Massachusetts Climate Bill. We think that's the right number to be achieving. And we need to do even more after that to get to 98% decarbonization by 2050. Offshore wind also has a lot of important policy implications at the federal level. We have to speed up the permitting process. Vineyard Wind has been slowed down because we expected it to pass through all of its environmental permits a long time ago. Unfortunately, the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management took longer than expected on some of those things, kept delaying the release of their environmental impact reviews. And most recently, in the beginning of December, Vineyard Wind announced that they were suspending their application to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management so that they have time to redesign their turbines with a different turbine manufacturer. This turbine manufacturer, I think it's kind of cool. They're super big turbines, so they will need fewer turbines in the water to achieve the same amount of electricity coming onto the grid. Further, the Congress determines investment tax credits, which can bring big savings to ratepayers when it comes to the cost of building these projects. The stimulus package that was passed also a few weeks ago in December included a 30% investment tax credit for offshore wind, and that will result in 10% savings to consumers for the Mayflower Wind project. We are all optimistic that the new Congress and the incoming administration will be supporting offshore wind across the board and will speed up the permitting process. I think there's a good sign with the incoming cabinet. So although the federal level has been a barrier so far, hopefully some of those barriers will be removed. Next slide. Some of the big barriers do remain though. First, as I mentioned, federal permits take time and we don't have a lot of time when it comes to the climate crisis. We have big goals and 2025 and 2030 are going to sneak up on us the same way that 2020, I think, snuck up on some of the policymakers who haven't been doing enough. Further, transmission infrastructure is complex and it is already filling up. Although transmission is not something that green energy consumers spends a lot of time advocating for, there will need to be some efforts to coordinate transmission infrastructure upgrades, given the huge amount of offshore wind that is already being planned and developed. Some of the interconnection spots on the coastline, the amount of electricity that they can accept and interconnect into the grid is being filled up. And transmission is expensive. It's really expensive to build big wires that could take all this electricity and bring it to all of the places around New England and the Northeast. Does each project build its own road into the population centers inland, or can we tap into a common highway? Where will future projects interconnect? Will we all be able to coordinate on transmission to make the cost of transmission cheaper, or will we kind of do it project by project, which might be easier from a coordination perspective, but might mean more cost to ratepayers? So that's something that we'll have to figure out as these projects begin to come online. Two other components as we think about advocating for more offshore wind is making sure that there's good protection of wildlife. National Wildlife Federation and others have done a great job coming to agreements with offshore wind companies to make sure that these projects don't endanger the right whales and other endangered species. We also want to make sure we are respecting the existing marine industries and supporting them where possible, like commercial fishing. Job creation should be equitable and local. We want to make sure that these projects will have huge economic benefits to our states, but keeping those jobs in state and maximizing the economic benefits can help make sure that they're providing all the benefits they can to our states. And next slide. There are things that you can do to support offshore wind as it comes onto the grid, because it is not being done fast enough and we still need a lot more of it. First, you can comment in support of the offshore wind request for proposal, which should be filed at the Public Utilities Commission in the coming months. We don't have a link for you to do this right now, simply because we're still waiting on that proposal to be filed. This is the offshore wind request for proposal that should end up supporting the 600 megawatt procurement that is really important to get us to 82% of our offshore wind by 2030, 82% of our electricity renewable by 2030. In addition, as I mentioned, passing the 100% renewable energy standard is necessary to get to that goal. This legislative session, which has just begun, will include a bill to do that, and we will notify you at the moments where you can testify at a hearing, call your legislator, or write a postcard to your legislator to call upon them to get to the 100% renewable energy standard. And next slide. In Massachusetts, also, even though the climate bill did not pass, there are things that you can be doing. The Clean Energy and Climate Plan is a plan that was released at the very end of December, and it lays out the governor's framework to getting to the 45% emissions reductions by 2030 goal. You can submit your comments on this plan until February 22nd, and we have a couple of key suggestions. We think that this plan should include more clean electricity. It doesn't do enough to get to a really high goal for clean electricity by 2030. The plan currently would let Rhode Island leapfrog Massachusetts, because Rhode Island is already planning to get to 100% by 2030. And we also think that it should be going beyond existing procurements of offshore wind. The plan says that our existing procurements of offshore wind are enough, but we know that we can be doing better, and that it takes a really, really long time to get these projects procured and built. So why not start now? Next slide.
Thank you, Kai. Folks, we're in the back stretch of this presentation, then we'll have questions and answers. First of all, we hope you enjoyed this webinar. We're not done yet, though. And if you want to support our organization, you can go to our website at greenenergyconsumers.org/give now. Then you can support the great work that Kai does, Mal does, and this is Priscilla, our Rhode Island director, enjoying a trip to the Block Island wind farm. Next slide. We do a lot of webinars. COVID has inspired us in that respect. So on Wednesday, this coming Wednesday, we're going to do a repeat of the Mass Climate Policy webinar that we did a couple days ago. Actually, it'll have different content because now we have to respond to the fact that Governor Baker did a very bad thing. He vetoed a very good climate bill. And so we'll talk about the climate bill, and we'll talk about the Massachusetts Clean Energy and Climate Plan. If you have heating oil, we have a webinar on the 26th and 27th to talk about how you can save energy at that kind of house. We do an electric vehicles 101. Either Mal or one of her colleagues in the Drive Green program will deliver that February 10th. Solar Made Easy, February 17th. And then also we have got a couple more that we will schedule on the Transportation Climate Initiative in mid-February, and Rhode Island Advocacy in later February. And you can register for all of these at greenenergyconsumers.org/events. Next slide. You can learn all about our organization and energy policy at our blog is the best way, greenenergyconsumers.org/blog. But please subscribe to it, and then you'll get it in your inbox. And you can learn about all our different programs at greenenergyconsumers.org. Next slide. I think that's it. So with that, Mal, I bet you we have some questions.
We do have some questions. Thank you everyone for sending them in. As we go on, please continue to do so. I'll start off with one question that asks, why are we only advocating for 50% renewable electricity in Massachusetts, but 100% in Rhode Island? Why not more in Massachusetts?
Good point. I think what we're saying is we're trying to work with what we have. We want to see 100% green electricity in Massachusetts as well. We'll get into that more in the webinar on January 20th. But in Massachusetts, the state's committed to getting about 20% of its power from Canadian hydro. That's already been legislated. That's already actually been contracted. That should come into play around 2023 or 24. And we are trying to advocate that that the state continue its procurements of offshore wind and adding more solar so that we can get to at least 80% by 2030, if not 100%.
That also might have been me misspeaking, but I think there is a confusing similarity of wording between 100% renewable energy and 100% renewable electricity. It's really important to note that although the governors of Rhode Island, the Rhode Island governor's executive order last January was called the 100% renewable energy goal, she only meant the electricity sector, which is only 25% of emissions in Rhode Island. So in Rhode Island, we're advocating for 100% renewable electricity, which is 25% of our overall energy sector. And in Massachusetts, we're advocating for 50% renewable energy. So that's 50% of the whole. Getting there will require a lot more than 50% when it comes to emissions from our electric sector. So as Larry said, what we're advocating for in Massachusetts when it comes to electricity is more like 80%.
The other confusion could be, I think we were also talking about Massachusetts setting a goal of 45 or 50% reduction in emissions by 2030 compared to the 1990 benchmark level. And so that number, 50%, is lower than the number that we'll have in terms of green electricity. And that's actually part of the point, which is probably the easiest, fastest way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is with the electricity sector, particularly with offshore wind costs coming down. But part of the long-term play is that strategic electrification. When we lead with a grid that is already much cleaner than people think, and then we add electric cars and we add heat pumps, that's how we reduce emissions in the building and transportation sectors. And so just another point, right now, if you were to switch from your gasoline car to an electric car, you would reduce the emissions from transportation by at least 75%. When we start adding in all this offshore wind and the Canadian hydro, you're going to be driving essentially emission-free or heating your home with heat pumps essentially emission-free before you know it, as long as we stay to the schedule. Next question. No?
Yeah, so while we're on the topic of the different goals that the governors in Massachusetts and Rhode Island have, we have a couple of questions about the climate roadmap bill and why Governor Baker decided to veto it. So the question is, did Governor Baker indicate why he vetoed the bill? And is there an appetite for the legislature to override his veto?
Yes. So I'll answer the last question first, which is, although the legislature would absolutely override the veto if they had the opportunity, unfortunately, they don't have any time because the legislative session already ended. So there is no opportunity to override the veto. That's because they sent the bill to Baker just one day before the legislative session ended. And so the governor had the opportunity to do an unoverridable veto by letting the legislative session expire. So the good news is that both the Speaker and the Senate President have said that they will introduce the bill again and make sure that it gets passed. Best case scenario, they do that. It flies through the whole process required to pass a bill. There's a ton of support from advocates once again, and we get the climate bill in the near future. If we're being realistic or pessimistic, there's a very good chance that there's so many cooks in the kitchen, people will want to change the bill again. It will get drawn out in the hearing process. We'll see a really long conference committee negotiation process again. The governor will want to make changes. So I will say I'm personally not optimistic that this bill will fly through the process towards enactment, but we will endeavor to make it so. I think the first
that's where everyone on this call can help surprise Kai. Okay, with your effort, the message will get to the House and the Senate that they should pass the good bill quickly, and with a large enough, they have the votes to override a governor's veto, a second veto from the governor. So we can do this.
Absolutely. I think there needs to be a huge push as soon as this bill is introduced to get this through as fast as possible, because we just can't afford another 2 years of not acting. The other question was why Baker vetoed it. I will give and whether or not he indicated why. So he did release a statement indicating why he does not support the bill. It is interesting. It's pretty easy to find if you want to read it. it talks about affordable housing, it talks about his climate goals, and gives some reasoning saying that he thinks that the climate bill and how the additional ambition of this climate bill will affect the economy. From our perspective, we don't agree with this statement because he doesn't justify any of his reasoning around how the climate bill will impact the economy. We know that the clean energy industry that is supported by this climate bill is one of the fastest growing segments of our economy. And we also know that the climate crisis is going to be the biggest detriment to our economy that we could imagine. Another reason could be that he was frustrated that the legislature didn't give him enough time to review. However, we believe that there is a clear mandate from the people of Massachusetts and the legislature that we want this type of ambition, so this should have passed. And the final reason that I'll mention is that there were reportedly some business interests, specifically from real estate, lobbying against this bill. They were concerned about certain building code requirements around zero energy. We think that this was a boon to the real estate industry because the future of housing is in super energy efficient buildings. It's awesome to live in an energy efficient home, and that's a real benefit. But there's some resistance to change. So we hope that all of this will not be a problem in a few months when the legislature passes a veto-proof version of this bill.
Thanks for those responses. I'm going to shift gears because we have a lot of questions coming in about the potential impact on wildlife. So I'd like to, focus on a little bit about what Kai was talking about regarding the efforts with the National Wildlife Federation. And the question is how renewable energy advocates and wildlife protection organizations can work together moving forward on the protection issue.
Great question. I'll first give a shout out to a coalition that we're involved with, New England for Offshore Wind, that is convened by the National Wildlife Federation, and they're all in on offshore wind. I think most environmental organizations, whether they are focused on wildlife or on climate, agree that the climate crisis is the biggest threat to humans and wildlife and our natural environments alike. And offshore wind is key to fighting the climate crisis. We work together pretty well. One thing that we always include in our comments on offshore wind is the importance of wildlife protections. There's a number of really cool ways in which offshore wind companies can minimize the impact on wildlife. For example, they have to use like 2 or 3 different mechanisms of making sure that there are no right whales in the area before they start drilling to place the wind turbines. Those mechanisms include some guy with binoculars looking out for right whales, in addition to more technically advanced radar options. So there are some good options to making sure that it doesn't impact wildlife too much. Turbines are not a big threat to birds, and there is some evidence that they'll actually create a better environment for marine animals because they create opportunities for shellfish and vegetation to grow off of the turbine. So we are pretty confident that things are going to be pretty okay for wildlife, but we do communicate very closely with wildlife protection organizations to make sure that works out. And if you are interested in wildlife, there's lots of ways for you to get involved in that as well.
If I could just add, our organization, like a lot of the allies we are with, totally support the very diligent siting of wind turbines and the analyses that Kai pointed out. I think right now, as we speak, there's another organization giving out prizes to startups that are working on trying to better predict the migration patterns of marine mammals to around offshore wind turbines. And so we think there just has to be almost like an Apollo project focus on how to do this right. And that for years, oil and gas industries were able to put their infrastructure wherever they wanted with no regard to either people's public health or to wildlife. And the delays in the permitting of the offshore wind projects we've talked about has not been because of as much because of concerns about wildlife. It's basically because the Trump administration has been slowing it down on behalf of the oil and gas industries. And so we think if there should be due diligence to make sure future projects are done right from the wildlife perspective, but we've got to put all of our effort behind that.
It's great to hear that there is alignment between those two priorities. There is one question that points out there is often opposition to transmission infrastructure that comes from other environmental advocates as well. And they point out that impacts of climate disruption are only mitigated by going to zero carbon. So what are better ways of communicating to such advocates and activists the need for trade-offs and how to assess those?
That's a tough question. I think we are just existing in a world of complexity where there is no perfect solution. And hopefully presentations like this one can help illustrate that complexity, where there might be some trade-offs. On the transmission front, again, there are ways to do it better and there are ways to do it worse. We're going to need this transmission, but we can make sure that we have fewer transmission lines by doing good coordination and planning before we have built all of them. And we can also do our best to make sure the transmission lines are going through areas with minimal impact on environmental justice communities or on really important environmental areas.
Yes, and just to add, we think that we need to build as many offshore wind turbines as necessary to get to our carbon goals, but we don't need more than necessary, which means we all just need to use energy as efficiently as we can. It can make a huge impact on not just the number of offshore wind turbines, but the number of solar panels we all need, and on and on. So using energy efficiently is a big part of all the solutions that are in the studies that we talked about.
And that's actually a perfect segue into this next question, because we all know that energy efficiency saves ratepayers actual real dollars on their utility bills. And so one person is curious as to whether there is any data or projections on the cost impacts to household electric bills from the addition of offshore wind.
Yeah, several months ago, we did a blog. You can go to our blog, and we worked on it with Patrick Knight of Synapse Energy Economics. The cost of offshore wind, it just keeps falling dramatically. And we still haven't reached quite the same cost reduction that they've seen in Europe, because they've been at it in Europe for so much longer at larger scale. But the Mayflower Wind Project, for example, Vineyard Wind Project, Revolution Wind Project, they're all coming in at very affordable prices. Again, what you get with an offshore wind project is you can lock in your rate for the life of the wind turbine, the life of the contract. The alternative is to bet that natural gas prices will be cheap for the rest of our lives. And the reality is we can't have a planet that's based upon natural gas electricity generation. And so to me, I think we're going to have good, stable, affordable prices with the offshore wind projects. And keep watching these RFPs for new projects, like the Rhode Island one for 600 megawatts, probably going to come in again at an astounding price.
Yeah, I think we forgot to mention that offshore wind is pretty much the cheapest electricity available to us right now.
And just to keep pouring it on here, we create tons of jobs, good paying union jobs of all types, for entry-level workers to experienced journeyman electricians and such, that keeps the dollars in our states. Right now, 80% or more of our energy bill leaves Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So we send it to hostile places like Texas, where they just take our money and they're happy with it because we bought their oil and their gas.
So the other big priority for a lot of ratepayers is reliability, making sure that the power and energy is there when you need it. Can you talk a little bit about how reliability will be affected, and if there are any efforts to pair battery storage with the big projections in offshore wind?
Yeah, we could if we wanted to even go back to the slide where we look at electricity demands and sources over the course of the year. But we don't need to also because I can explain it. But we are pretty lucky that when solar is not going to be producing electricity for our grid, offshore wind is going to be creating a lot. Offshore wind produces the most electricity at night and during the winter. That's when it's the windiest out on the ocean, and that is when solar is not producing at all. So that helps a little bit of the way get to reliability. However, there absolutely will be winter nights where for whatever reason there is not a lot of wind. And so developing battery storage will be key. Likely, the Rhode Island study demonstrated that until 2030, we will likely have enough grid reliability, but past 2030 is when we're going to start needing to get serious about storage. The good news is that battery storage, the prices are falling even more dramatically than offshore wind and solar prices. So we should have some good affordable technology options in the coming decades. Another key component will be how electric vehicles play into this. Electric vehicles could be like portable batteries. They can help us ride through periods when we don't have a lot of offshore wind or solar electricity coming onto the grid. Demand response and being aware of when we're using electricity will also be important. We advocate for time of use electricity rates that send a clear price signal to energy consumers that it's time to use less electricity or to discharge from your battery rather than charging your battery when renewable electricity coming into the grid is low.
And an important factor is the fact that each one of the 6 New England states is part of the power pool. It's an integrated grid of New England, and so even if Rhode Island was 100% renewable energy, in reality, the electrons that flow from the offshore wind projects in Rhode Island, if could be producing on a given day, along with solar and whatnot, could be producing maybe more electricity at a moment than Rhode Island would be using, but that's not going to get lost. It will flow into the larger New England power grid. So it becomes an issue when the whole more of an issue when the whole region gets up to getting close to 100%, and that's when all these other factors that Kai pointed out will become more and more important. Those things will come along gradually, on time, where you have no doubt about that.
So from what I understand, reliability is largely a system-wide issue, but Massachusetts also has municipal light plants that control the electricity distribution for cities and towns. So can you speak to whether those municipal light plants are doing contracts for offshore wind?
Yes. So in Massachusetts, about 86% of the electricity load is managed by 3 investor utilities, Eversource, National Grid, and Unitil, which is up in the Fitchburg area. And there are 40 or 41 cities and towns that have a municipal utility that's sort of independent and from all the other cities and towns. And I believe, to my knowledge, right now, the commitments of offshore wind that we're talking about are applying to Eversource, National Grid, and Unitil. There is a part of the bill, the climate bill, and there could even be part in the Clean Energy Plan that will start making the municipal utilities have to match over time the same requirements for renewable energy that we see for the investor-owned utilities. We actually regulate the investor-owned utilities better, stronger than the municipal utilities. So to my knowledge, right now, they're not in the offshore wind procurement game, but I suspect that they will get there.
Great. And as a follow-up question to that, because I know you love talking about our green municipal aggregation program. One person is asking, why is it taking so long for the DPU to approve their community's aggregation plan? Could you speak to that?
Yeah, I can't apologize for them. I can actually condemn the Department of Public Utilities for not doing their job. There are cities and towns that are in a queue. Their community has approved a municipal aggregation plan. and but that by law, the Department of Public Utilities has to review it and approve it before they can start it up. And they've been slow for a couple of years now. Boston got approved a little while ago, but it took a year. A lot of communities have taken a year, and now there's still a few that are still waiting. So we are hoping that the Baker administration will up their game. We'll be making that comment clear in our clean energy and climate plan. Just a reminder for folks who aren't aware, in Massachusetts and now Rhode Island, a city or town can choose municipal aggregation where they will get an electricity supply separate from the supply from the utility, and they can choose to have more renewable energy than required by the state's mandate. So we work with a lot of communities in Massachusetts, and we're really excited that a whole bunch in Rhode Island have signed up, and they are going through the process at the Rhode Island Public Utilities Commission. And they haven't been waiting a year, so we're not blaming the PUC in that respect. But Providence and South Kingstown and several others, Central Falls, are going to be getting more green electricity than required by law within a few months, and that's having a huge impact on renewable energy demand in the region.
Great. Yeah, and it's definitely great to see more local governments and municipalities participating in these kinds of conversations. Do you have a sense of how local governments, particularly those in coastal communities with interconnection points, will be responding to offshore wind and how they can get involved?
I don't know of any good examples of that personally. Larry, you should feel free to chime in. But I think that there's always opportunities to get involved. If you're located in Rhode Island, where we do have one important interconnection point so far, it would be great to get a town council thinking about this, submitting comments to the Public Utilities Commission when the proposal is opened up, and hopefully in support of offshore wind, because in addition to getting really great clean electricity coming into the state, there will be good jobs coming nearby. And so I think that in a lot of ways, offshore wind can be a benefit to communities, coastal communities, and the ones that are hosting interconnection points.
On that one, we really have to point out that on Cape Cod, some communities have not wanted to host the interconnection point, or certainly not at the particular location that the developers are proposing. And so we just call upon developers to be sensitive to community concerns, try to locate the interconnection points in the smartest places possible. We encourage government to oversee that, make sure that it's a process that's done fairly and well. And we want communities to have an open mind. I guess I have to make a comment here about environmental justice. For 100 years, fossil fuel facilities have been basically located in communities, low-income communities where Blacks, Indigenous people, and people of color have lived. And we don't want to do that with renewable energy. And so if the site's technically appropriate and can be done sensitively for the community, we hope that all communities will be considered. It should be driven by science and common sense and respect for others.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that insight. So going back to the question of grid reliability and the potential for developing technology, where are we with vehicle-to-grid technology or enabling electric vehicles to support the addition of more intermittent resources like offshore wind?
Just so happens the person telling us the question should answer that. That's right up Mal's wheelhouse. So go ahead.
Yeah, it feels kind of funny to be answering my own question, but yeah, happy to take this one on. So as it stands, Most vehicles that are on the market today aren't quite ready to be talking to the grid, but it's not a question of technological readiness. It's more of just it's not a feature being built into the cars yet. It's kind of like if you can think about, new iPhone models that have like the latest and greatest tech, that's kind of what we can expect for the next generation of electric vehicles. But in terms of preparing for that kind of technology, Green Energy Consumers is participating in DPU dockets where we're discussing what the future interaction of electric vehicles and the transmission grid will be. Right now, that's focused on smart charging, so getting electric vehicle owners to charge their vehicles when it's most advantageous to the entire system. And then, I think it's called V1G as a kind of moniker. And then from there, the ability to have two-way communication between electric vehicles and the overall system is the next little baby step. So we're working on it, but it's probably quite a few years away before you can, use your electric vehicle battery to power your home in a blackout or something like that. That's something we're really looking forward to. It is 1 o'clock, so I want to be mindful of time. We have a couple of more questions coming in. If both Larry and Kai are still down to answer them.
Let's go.
Okay. So we have one question that goes back a little bit to what Kai was talking about regarding making sure that offshore wind is good for local labor and creates local jobs. What should folks be advocating for so that offshore wind is good for workers in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, knowing that the criticism from a lot of labor advocates is that offshore wind creates jobs for workers outside of the region?
Well, I will give the caveat that I and Green Energy Consumers are definitely not workforce development or labor experts, and going to the unions or organizations like Blue Green Alliance, who are heavily involved with offshore wind, will get you a better answer. However, my understanding is that there's a number of ways that you can ensure that offshore wind projects and any new green development are creating high quality jobs in state. One way is that some of the offshore wind contracts have stipulations around workforce development and also around in-state jobs and making sure that a certain percentage of jobs are coming from in-state union workers. One thing that has been happening in Rhode Island is a lot of the establishment of a offshore wind job training center at URI. And in Massachusetts, we've seen some of the contracts denote a certain amount of money towards workforce development and making sure that these are good jobs. I think there is more that still could be done. One piece of legislation that the Offshore Wind Coalition in Massachusetts is considering would put in statute some principles that should be included considered when selecting an offshore wind project. These principles include wildlife protection, in-state jobs, equitable development, affordability, as well as some transmission components.
Great, and your response to that question actually covered the one other question that I was going to ask. So for the interest of time, we can skip it. And if Larry and Kai, you want to make your final remarks, I think we're ready.
Well, just on behalf of Kai, Mel, and everybody else at Green Energy Consumers, hope you enjoyed this. The object of our webinar here was to try to get you motivated to understand where offshore wind fit into our future. We want to hasten the future, and we want to get you involved in talking to your policymakers at the state level, whether you live in Massachusetts or Rhode Island. The analysis is very clear to us that if you want to reduce greenhouse gases, you've got to really be supportive of offshore wind as long as it's developed properly. And so if you have further questions, you can find us right on the slide in front of you is Kai's email address, but we're all our first name at greenenergyconsumers.org. So thank you. Kai, do you want to wrap up or?
Sure. Thank you all. Thanks, Larry. And one last reminder to, if you are a Massachusetts resident, submit comments on the Clean Energy and Climate Plan. If you want additional guidance for what to put on those comments, stay tuned for a blog from us that will be posted in the next week or two. And that will outline the things that we think need to be improved about the Clean Energy and Climate Plan. And in Rhode Island, for Rhode Island residents, also stay tuned. Please help us support the Renewable Energy Standard, make it to the finish line and get enacted in the legislative session that ends in June. We'll be having action alerts from now until June around 100% renewable electricity. We'll also call upon our members in Rhode Island to support the 600 megawatt offshore wind procurement in the Public Utilities Commission. And you can help us do all of this work, especially on advocacy, by donating at greenenergyconsumers.org/give now.
Have a great day. Long weekend. Let's think about Martin Luther King.